In keeping with today's topic, our National Park Service tour reaches all the way west to North Dakota, since part of the story takes place there, and it's definitely north of the Pemmican Jerky line. This time, I am going to be talking about the Knife River Indian Villages National Historic Site. To anyone touring the country in a car or on an airplane, it seems like the middle of nowhere. But not that long ago, even while railroads were making their way across the country, the Knife River was a thriving market center. It was still a place where people were living their complex lives in their earth lodges, farming, hunting, making art, and trading with Canadians, French and English, and the New Americans, including Lewis and Clark and their expedition. This is also the region that was home to Sacagawea, or as most Americans know her name, Sacagawea. It was a meeting place for the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara. The Knife River had villages of homes suited to North Dakota prairie winters and were supported by summer hunting and fishing camps and farming and plant foraging missions. And one of the most important meat storage techniques practiced by the people living, farming, and hunting along the Knife River was the making of what we generally know as pemmican, some of which was loaded into the Corps of Discovery's supplies. And while pemmican may be the food product that comes to mind for the region, this is also the area known for the intricate beadwork items usually decorated with floral patterns: gloves, capes, skirts, jackets, belts, horse gear, boots, moccasins, hair wraps, and more items, all absolutely paved with tiny beads that were acquired by the tribes in exchange for the furs and skins they hunted for the Northwest Company and the Hudson's Bay Company. And just for reference, there is a thriving modern art scene of tribal designs in these beads that continues to flourish among the artists of the Plains tribes that continue to live, work, and take inspiration from the landscape. There'll be some links in the show notes to see both artworks of the past and the present. And it's also important to remember that this beadwork didn't appear out of nowhere. Before the European glass beads, there was already a thriving decorative art style developed over centuries that used stone, shell, bone, and quills along with other natural materials and dyes. So if you want to see some stars and how the world sounds when it's just wind, water, and sounds made by living things, gear up for a trip to the Knife River Indian Villages near the Fort Berthold Reservation and Bismarck, North Dakota, to see where early America spent time working cooperatively with locals before it was all railroads, cows, and soybeans. The Knife River villages are also one of the many places that's visited by the Great Northern Trail that I described back in episode 94. The trail also crosses the Red River, which also happens to be part of the North Dakota-Minnesota border and is about 240 miles or 400 kilometers to the east. And the Red River has a starring role in today's episode. So let's get started with that. Episode 110, The Pemmican Wars. One era ends and something else begins. Hello, and welcome to the History of American Food. This week, I'll be looking at one of the elements that made modern war and adventure possible, an item far ahead of its time in European provisioning circles. That's right, pemmican, and the war that was fought about it, and how both the war and pemmican itself is a past reflection of something that's going on in our world right now. So pull up to your place at the table and let's dig in. The first thing you need to know is that the technological advancement that pemmican represented to late 18th century and early 19th century travelers and fortune hunters is hard to understand in our age of ice chests, freeze-dried instant food, and MREs with little packs of Skittles in them. But the way it extended the range of human endeavor and caused men to dream dreams of new avarice in forms unknown to the past, well, that might seem a bit familiar. Back in episode 84, I explained about what pemmican is in depth. For now, I'll just remind you that it's made of a variety of wild meat, almost always from deer species, elk, moose, etc., and most famously, bison or buffalo as they were incorrectly identified at the time. Anyway, the big, snorty, woolly prairie cow cousins. And it was only made by tribes living in areas that were far enough north to have the proper amount of cold weather and in areas that had adequate dry, clear, cold days to wind dry, almost freeze dry, but not quite, the meat. Before mechanical refrigeration and air circulation, these were required conditions for making pemmican. Otherwise, people made jerky, which used a hot fire to dry and smoke meat. Pemmican was a combination of three things that created this almost miraculous food. First was that cold air dried meat. This method meant that the meat had almost no live parasites or viable bacteria in it. It couldn't host any creepy crawlies that could make humans sick. The second was fat, ideally from the animal that had provided the meat. The watery fats like marrow and belly fat made for soft, perishable, but also tastier pemmicans. But those were not the desirable ones for travel food or for the commercial product that was to develop. The good stuff for making money and war used back fat, like tallow and bison hump fat. Like lard, these have far less water and are harder and make a longer-lasting travel pemmican that doesn't go rancid. The third, and to Europeans possibly the most mysterious ingredient, was the fruit. It acted as a source of vitamins and fiber, and the use of local berries provided that certain something that was missing from the diets of European soldiers and adventurers. Before the introduction of pemmican, a voyageur, fur trapper, soldier, or other hardy wanderer would subsist on diets of things like lard and cornmeal, or salt fish and rancid butter, or salt beef and hard cheese. Protein and fat, while essential, aren't enough. Without fiber, your digestive system gets, all stopped up. And without vitamin C and other nutrients that accompany it, your body's tissues literally start to unravel, causing teeth to become unanchored and fall out, and your skin and blood vessels lose their coherence. You more or less bruise to death, and that's really gross. But by including service berries or ground cherries or blueberries or cranberries or huckleberries or, well, you get the picture. You get to keep your teeth and your aorta, along with the energy to keep you paddling or walking or whatever. Modern fans and fanatics of pemmican tend to call it the original energy bar. And it is true, pemmican could be and can be eaten as is, but it was much more common to use it as sort of a bouillon cube, a soup or a stew base. Partly because the long-keeping stuff was pretty solid and generally tough to gnaw on. Partly because foraging leaves and tubers to cook in the broth was a common practice for most pemmican consumers, and partly because eating and moving were distinctly different activities for most people at this time. Snacking on the go was actually pretty uncommon. And not just in this place and time, eating and working are distinctly different activities for most of recorded human history. One sat down and ate at a table around a fire, gathered around serving dishes, standing in a food cart or food stall or in a tavern, or even just as a rest during travel on the side of the trail. And for most people, especially while traveling, eating was also the time when people drank liquids, and drinking a rich soup was a common way to get that hydration. The modern and very American habit of eating meals on the go is extremely recent and is an outlier in recorded human history around the world. But what's more interesting and contemporary to the excitement about pemmican by Europeans, that's here in the mid-18th century more or less, was the similar fascination with something known as portable soup or pocket soup, or also known as a more questionable name, veal glue. This substance was made by boiling the absolute dickens out of meat scraps and bones, preferably stuffed with plenty of collagen, thus the popularity of veal as an ingredient. The first intonations of such a substance show up in English writings in the 16th century as a possible war or travel food. Not surprising considering that England kept on being at war with everyone and usually had to take a boat to go do it. So while it was in use here and there for around 200 years, Hannah Glass's cookbook in 1747 includes recipes for making both pocket and portable soup, S-O-O-P, just for fun. And it was first commercialized by a British tavern owner, one Mrs. Elizabeth Dubois, who won a contract for its manufacture from the British Navy in 1756. From there, pocket soup or veal glue was included in every well-appointed voyage and expedition, sometimes as a preventative for scurvy, at which it failed miserably, and sometimes just as emergency rations to keep people on their feet until better food could be found, and it was actually effective at doing that. But this was the European attempt at a concentrated instant food that could be prepared in bulk and preserved for eating a long way away from where it was made with minimal effort and few other ingredients. In their colonial explorations and transfer of war to ocean and over it, stable, high-calorie, fairly instant foods were becoming an obsession of this age. Even though they didn't know what calories really were, they still were looking for foods that gave people a lot of energy to keep going for a long time. And pemmican was the first one that really fit that bill. It could be made in bulk. It lasted a very long time with little or no attention. Basically, just keep it dry and not too warm. And it required very little time, very little equipment, and very little skill to make it edible. And unlike pocket soup or those other combinations, lard and cornmeal, salt fish and butter, salt beef and cheese, pemmican also kept scurvy at bay. So of course there was a war about it. The events that are generally called the Pemmican War run from about 1815 to around 1821. Technically, this is just outside my self-defined time of war and adventure, and it takes place outside of what was America then. Rather, it all takes place in what will become North Dakota, Minnesota, and the Canadian provinces of Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and Ontario. But hang in there. Even though it is technically outside our delineated time period and outside the America as it was at the time, the roots of the war were anchored in the past that we've talked about, and the spark for it lies right smack inside our time period. And since the motivations are entirely war, conquest, adventure, and money, so much money, I feel like it really fits in here. So after cod and timber, hands down, the best moneymaker for a North American adventurer lay in the animal wealth of the continent, specifically the furry skins of the furriest animals. Europe, having been largely civilized and cleaned out of its biggest and furriest animals, was on the lookout for easier pickings. Sure, there were still bears and martens and ermines in Sweden and Russia and stuff, but those lands were cold and full of Russians and Swedes who generally didn't want you there, and they also often had guns. But America, it had wildcats and beavers and foxes and hares and raccoons and minks, along with bears and any number of other furry weasels, and was notably lacking in people with guns. And the people who were there, they might not want you there, but they were notably spread out and largely avoidable in the areas where the most furry animals were to be found. So at first, the voyageurs and other fur hunters would go out there and hunt the furry animals, but after a while it became more economical to get the locals, the people already in North America, to just hunt the furry animals for pay in guns or liquor or glass beads or knives, pans, cloth, and so on. In fact, there was an entire class of special blankets that were manufactured first in France and then in England specifically for this trade. Possibly the most enduring symbol of this trade were the Hudson's Bay blankets. They can still be found for sale today, as well as the iconic jackets made from them. There's still a lively vintage and custom manufacture market even 300 years later. And I do have links in the show notes to pictures of some of this stuff. Well, anyway, with that much money involved, it was time to expand the trade. to the point where there was room enough for 2 big companies. Okay, at the beginning, there were many more companies, but as trading posts began to expand into the interior of the continent, the operation of getting furs back to Europe became professionalized, and that meant there were serious logistics, and so the whole thing got boiled down to 2 companies. These were the Northwest Company and the Hudson's Bay Company. With the expansion of the fur operation thousands of miles into the interior of North America, logistics weren't just about bringing in trade goods. There was also the serious matter of keeping company employees fed. And on these prairies, where obtaining, processing, and making food was more or less a full-time job, prepared stable food that kept one safe from starvation and scurvy was a valuable commodity. As a result, the market for furs meant a side market for pemmican also grew up. Much of the for-sale, commercial-style pemmican went to these fur companies to supply their employees, but another notable amount was fed into the growing military and explorer presence of the British and the Americans as they extended along the rivers and lakes of the area. Because the fur traders were so dependent upon the pemmican, it was literally an essential element of the fur trading system. As a result, rules started to get made, prices went up, and more people went into its production. And of these 2 companies, the Northwest Company was the most dependent on pemmican. The Hudson's Bay Company was still importing most of its food from England. After all, the Hudson's Bay Company was a British company, headquartered in England, founded under a royal charter in 1670 to exploit the fur wealth of this new British thingy. The Northwest Company was an 18th century upstart founded in Montreal by enterprising Englishmen seeking to break the Hudson's Bay monopoly, which is why they were mostly locally supplied. Post-Revolutionary War, and about the time Lewis and Clark were out exploring the Louisiana Purchase, the British started to get a little more serious about mapping out more or less exactly what was the British Empire way out there and what could be left up to those pesky upstart tea-haters. And by serious, I meant they just started drawing lines on maps and granting stuff to men who showed up with money. The early 19th century found the British Empire a bit short of funds quite a few times. And even though the first North American colonial effort had blown up in their faces, the British were willing to try again, especially with disgruntled Scotsmen, including those Ulster Scots, who are also known as the Scots-Irish. They'd all been tied up somehow with Bonnie Prince Charlie or something, and were still looking for a farm that would make them happy. So, one Thomas Douglas, Earl Selkirk, had actually done a pretty good job of setting up colonies 2 previous times, first in Prince Edward Island and then in Western Ontario. So when he did some shenanigans with the Hudson's Bay Company to set up a 3rd colony in the Red River Basin, no one really felt like trying to stop him. So yes, we have a rich guy with lots of government connections and some clout, tromping around and planning to drop a colony into what he thinks of as the middle of nowhere, but where lots of people were already living and doing lots of things. Sound familiar? To understand how things are going to go wrong in this case, it's important to know who was already running around this Red River Basin area. To picture where the river is, remember that it's the current border between North Dakota and Minnesota. So this area covers land that was just to the west of what everyone had been fighting over in the lake battles of the War of 1812. First of all, the Northern or Plains Ojibwa Nation inhabited the land and rubbed up against the territories controlled by the Mandan, the Hidatsa, and the Arikara to the west and south. And intermingled between these First Nation villages were the Society of the Métis. These were a fairly recently coalesced people who represented the children from the unions of First Nations women and the French voyageur fur traders. And let's be honest, probably the children of several of the priests that had been traveling with them. The Métis, with their own identity and traditions of a semi-nomadic hunting and trading-based life, served as a connection between the more sedentary and agricultural-based First Nations people and the colonizing Europeans. They had kinship ties to the local indigenous cultures and, as a result, access to skills and knowledge that European settlers did not. But they also had a better understanding of the economic systems of the Europeans and often shared some of the same religious traditions. And so, layered on top of the First Nations and the Métis, there were also the competing hunting grounds and trading posts, stations, and forts of the Northwest Company and the Hudson Bay Company. Over the decades, the Northwest Company's growth, along with the growing American and British Army presences, had turned Pemmican from a casual side hustle for anyone with some extra hanging from the rafters or buried in a cache to a profitable and over time largely protected business mainly run by the Métis tribes that had established themselves around the high northern plains over the previous century. The connections that the voyageur fathers, and by this time grandfathers and even great-grandfathers, had with the fur trading companies meant that financial transactions, especially large ones and those involving contracts with things like delivery dates and such, were easier to form with the Métis who had a foot in each world. And fitting into this worldview at the time, many of the company men just felt more comfortable dealing with people and providing firearms to people who had at least a passing acquaintance with Christianity. And so, the very nature of pemmican changed. Initially, it had been a local product for locals. It was tied to the cycles of the seasons, and it was tied to the cycles of the local large mammal population. Make it in winter when things are dry, clear, and cold. Make it when the animals are at their fattest, and make more of it when there are more animals, and not so much when there aren't so many. From that, it transformed into a product mainly to be sold, and so the timing and amounts began to be driven by contracts and profit rather than the realities of weather and the animals on the ground. Just as with cod and geese and pigeons. In the middle of the 17th century, when fur trapping expanded onto the high plains, it seemed as if the bison would never run out. Early explorers and local descriptions of the area both described rivers of those large woolly bison that could pass by for hours. And so for decades, when they were hunted by spear and dead-end traps and cliff jumps, even for the growing commercial pemmican trade, this endlessness still appeared to be true. But as the Métis gained both rifles and larger contracts for providing pemmican, this endlessness changed. The abundance of the bison was no longer local or predictable, and so people had to travel further afield to capture enough bison to fulfill the need for pemmican. Another cause of the decline of the local bison is that making pemmican, the true way, the original way, is a nose-to-tail operation. The bison are more or less entirely disassembled. Every handful of fat, every sinew, every strip of flesh had a use and a destination. But some of these processes were extremely time-consuming and possibly even more important in this circumstance, had low or no value in the pemmican contracts. Suddenly, the bison had valuable bits and less valuable bits. And instead of each bison providing a literal ton, that's just shy of a metric ton, of materiel for a family or tribe, a bison was now providing just 100-ish pounds or 50-ish kilos of meat and fat. All the hard-to-get bits that didn't pay were abandoned, left to be scavenged and rot on the prairie. And killing more bison now obviously meant fewer bison later. So a cycle of having to go further afield and not wanting to deal with the fussy bits would only become more intense. And as the larger and male bison were killed off first because of their hump fat, which was favored for long-storing commercial pemmican, that meant female bison had to be killed. But more female bison had to be killed to get the same amount of meat and to get the same amount of fat. When you start killing off the female bison, you're cutting into your future bison. And because the contract started to come year-round, Bison were also killed out of season in the spring and even the summer when they were lean and stringy. So again, more had to be killed to make up the same amount of pemmican. And all too often the summer kills would be wasted because the conditions to properly dry the meat for processing were not present. The weather would be too warm and the meat would spoil before it dried properly. And so a vicious spiral of killing more bison to make up for the bison that weren't there was entered into, which of course made for fewer bison, so more had to be killed, etc., etc. And it was into the middle of this depressing spiral that the under-provisioned, poorly prepared colonists were arriving. See, up to this moment, the Northwest Company had been paying for the pemmican that fueled their operation. The rates had been steady despite the fact that the efforts required to meet the contracts were ever greater, but at least it was a known and dependable amount. However, Earl Selkirk's colonists arrived and found themselves in dire straits. They were regularly threatened with starvation because they had underestimated the amount of food they needed to bring, and their desperation caused the already existing provision arrangements to be severely disarranged. Because supply and demand were so far out of whack, one of the first things that happened is that there were raids on storage facilities. New facilities built to replace them, improperly repaired storage facilities, and interruptions of ice deliveries meant that further supplies of meat and grease and pemmican that were delivered were often ruined by spoilage. The worsening of the situation and the further loss of food supplies caused the appointed governor of the Selkirk colony to assert that the areas used by both the Northwest Company and the Hudson Bay Company were exclusively Hudson's Bay land based on the charter that Selkirk had drawn up. And then this caused the original locals in the area to feel pressure to move out and give up food resources. And right in the middle of all of this confusion, a proclamation was issued that any foodstuffs in the area were to be reserved for colonists. No fur traders, especially those of the Northwest Company, or any of their associated hunters, traders, or trappers might take any foodstuffs from this Red River Basin area that the Selkirk colonists had claimed. So what had been a fairly stable payment relationship with the Métis had been broken up. The Selkirk colonists were demanding pemmican and other food supplies at severely reduced prices, or simply demanding delivery without payment. In a surprise to no one, the breakdown of established systems, unilateral proclamations, and a flood of unprepared colonists made everyone unhappy, and they started acting in desperate and destructive ways. There were seizures of guns, equipment, and food supplies. This was followed by arrests, attacks, and attempts to get locals, First Nations, and Métis to take sides. In response to the escalating chaos, Selkirk and the men in charge of his colony decided to take a page from the East India Company and raise their own army. And 1815 was a great time to do this. As the Napoleonic Wars in Europe, mainly in France, Spain, and the Low Countries, were winding down, there were units of mercenaries looking around for their next gig, and the same was true of the American and British War of 1812. As a result, a force made up of Hudson's Bay guys and unemployed Swiss mercenaries showed up to get paid by Selkirk and defend this next outpost. In response, the Northwest Company hired its own army. And since they were headquartered in Montreal, they tended to hire British soldiers let loose or those that had deserted from the northern end of the 1812 American conflict, the battles that had happened around Detroit and around the Great Lakes. And plenty of the guys on both sides were just wearing the uniforms that they had gotten from the last war that they were in, fighting for or against Napoleon or from leaving the northern contingents of the War of 1812. While that war wouldn't officially end until 1815, and it overlapped a bit with this conflict, the part that was still going on was almost unimaginably far away, down south, where the Mississippi empties into the Gulf of Mexico. As a result, the two armies raised by these business concerns, the Northwest Company and the Hudson's Bay Company, well, Selkirk's colony anyway, were really just a bunch of armed dudes paid by rich guys who weren't getting their way. And They were wearing the uniforms from the last war they were in. Neither of the companies even really had a sanction to raise armies and even hold a war. But they were so far away from anyone who cared to stop them, especially in this age of wind-powered sail, foot, and mule-driven wagon speeds, that they just kind of did it anyway. And all of this was on account of a guy deciding he's going to plop his unprepared colonists down in land that was already busy with people's lives and a trade network. He threw the whole food supplies of the area into a conflagration. Hunting patterns were messed up, battles were fought, homes and forts were burned, and you can tell Scots were involved because there were even cattle raids. I'm not going to say that the pemmican market wouldn't have eventually gotten as tragically fouled up just by the escalating competition between the Northwest Company and the Hudson's Bay Company if Selkirk hadn't dropped his colony into the middle of it. It likely would have, especially as the railroads moved in and the hunting habits encouraged by these fiercely commercial companies were draining the area of the once abundant fur animals. But Selkirk's colonization is what happened, and it did participate fighting and faster draining of the local bison population and worse treatment of the First Nations populations, as well as the worst treatment and even outright cheating of the local Métis, who tragically had really made the cross-land fur trading network possible in the first place. And so it was in the summer of 1816 that the Métis had enough. The squabbles and raids coalesced into enough battles to be called a war. The Pemmican War. The ongoing skirmishes, battles, blockades, and raids would continue until 1817. Deaths of colonists and employees of the Northwest Company and the Hudson's Bay Company would be dutifully recorded. Deaths of the First Nations people and the Métis would not. And this battle over food and land that need never have happened if people had just packed correctly or taken the time that was actually needed instead of just rushing everything, all ended up in a tangled heap at the Pemmican War trials in 1818 for murder, grand larceny, and arson. Few of the cases actually proceeded, and nothing was solved. Raids continued afterwards as protests of ruling and proclamations, or they were just done by people who didn't know or care about the rulings. They just wanted their way. And after all that, what happened? The two companies merged in 1821. The fur rush was coming to an end. In just over 100 years, fur had gone from plentiful and abundant across North America to once again becoming hard to get, off in the fringes of the continent, just like it was in Europe. The 17th century had been an era when agricultural wealth was the new wealth. The rush then was to find new plants and tame new lands for planting them. The race then had been about planting the most profitable crops everywhere they would grow. The result was sugar islands and coffee plantations and tea plantations and spice islands, rice fields, cocoa forests, and pineapple fields. And all of those had depended on the portable wealth of the age, labor. The 18th century into the 19th was the time when fur became the new way to make money fast. Fur of North America, yes, but also the fur of seals, sea lions, sea cows, and otters. While the high plains and the boreal forest of the Americas were being mined of their furs, the remote Arctic and then Antarctic islands that hosted all manner of marine mammals were also being denuded of their fur-bearing residents. So what the Pemmican War really revealed was the inklings of the new wealth of the 19th and 20th centuries: stored energy. Pemmican was an energy source that could be turned into labor. It was eminently portable and kept well for longer than anything like it before. And in its own way, this edible energy was a baby step that would help men reach for non-edible stored energy. The race for ever more whale and then seal blubber for lighting, then coal booms and coal gas. That's what lit many cities' street lights and later houses. And then on to liquid petroleum, and then finally electricity. In many ways, though pemmican was a food, it was the first extremely portable energy source to be the subject of a war in the Americas. Fights would continue over food and the land to grow it on, but it's with pemmican that the energy wars truly start. America was already prone to seeing food as mainly fuel to accomplish other activities for profit. Without even being a particularly well-known food to most Americans at the time, pemmican would become symbolic of the American attitude towards food. It's mainly fuel to get me where I want or need to go. None of its value really comes from being especially good. Now, it's true there always would be classes of people in America, both at its start all the way up to the present, who find value in tasty, carefully prepared food. For many it was and would be the wealth flex it indicated. For some it would be the connection to people or places far away. And for a few, the value was just the simple appreciation of food that was absolutely delicious. But the largest group, Psi, seems to be the ones that see food as a wealth signifier. And this definitely applied to wild game, even in the military, or maybe especially in the military where there were more rules and hierarchy was more rigidly enforced. Back in the early days of the colonies, game had lost its glamour since no one had cows anyway. But now that most people were eating a lot of farmyard animals or salted barreled meats of one sort or another, wild game was regaining its cachet, which after our little pemmican diversion this week, an exploration of fads and how to get and be rich, I will be finally turning to wild game in War and Adventure next week. Thanks for listening. Any email questions or quibbles will continue to reach me at thehistoryofamericanfood@gmail.com. Downloading the episode helps me know you are out there, but even better than that are your reviews. Let more people know you're listening and enjoying the show, or that you at least find it interesting. You want more food and history in your future? I have, for reasons, started another podcast that's more of a deep dive specifically into the 19th century with a co-host, Jamie Lewis of Plague of Strength. This is a much looser and rather wilder podcast. Prize fighters, circus freaks, and gangsters. Still food, but now it includes fashion, fighting, and fraud. Well, straight up crime. Lots of crime. Come check it out for a look at how modern media portrays the 19th century. Music for this podcast is Fingerlympics by Dr. Turtle, and you can find me on Threads and Insta as @THOAFood, but I'm mostly all X'd out. And all this information is available in the show description.